The 1990s were one of the most memorable decades in American history. Grunge and country and hip hop and pop music were all hitting their peaks. The fashion has really stood the test of time. I'm pretty sure it's the only decade where when kids go back and look at their parents, they actually want to mimic them versus make fun of them. Y2K was on the horizon and everything just felt tinted with optimism and hope for the future. It's really not surprising to me that there's so much nostalgia for it nowadays. But while the mainstream culture was exploding during this decade, so was a countercultural one. Christianity was going corporate in the 90s. For every Britney Spears, there was a Rebecca St. James on Christian radio. For every plaid shirt sold at Hot Topic, there was a WWJD bracelet finding a wrist. Evangelicalism was ascendant. It was fueled by megachurches and purity pledges and Christian rock bands. There was this huge booming industry of books and conferences and magazines and merch aimed squarely at teens like me. And it was an era that tried and I think somewhat successfully worked to make religion cool. There was this blend of moral conservatism and very market savvy branding that made faith feel both rebellious but also righteous. And growing up in this world, everything was about drawing lines between us and the world, right? We're constantly talking about what the world was doing and how we were different, and really using a lot of metrics like purity versus sin or faithfulness versus fallenness to mark that. For a long time, I've referred to this sort of brand of Christianity that I grew up in, which is the dominant one in American culture, as evangelical ink. And evangelical ink is marked by many things that I want to talk about today, but within the culture of it, there's always been this huge prioritization around modesty and gender roles and the idea that America's moral survival depends on sexual purity and submission to traditional values, which are, interestingly enough, themes that we're starting to see re-enter the cultural conversation amongst conservatives these days. As a homeschooled Southern Baptist preacher's daughter, I had a front row seat to all of this. And like most of my peers, I also got my True Love Waits ring around 8th grade, which is so creepy and weird in hindsight, but it happened. And I owned and read one of the most influential books during that movement, which was, of course, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Now, its author, Joshua Harris, became one of the most recognizable figures of that purity culture era and evangelical ink. His book sold over 1 million copies and became a guidebook for an entire generation of Christians. But in the years since, Josh has done something that few people ever do, which is that he publicly re-examined, apologized for, and ultimately renounced the very message and book that made him famous. I've been dying to talk to Joshua Harris since I was a little kid. Honestly, I'm so fascinated by his story and the impacts it had on my own life. So today, I'm finally getting the opportunity to sit down with him and talk about what led him to writing this book, his process of religious deconstruction, what purity culture did to an entire generation of people, and how he has worked around the impact that he has and now regrets, and ultimately what both of us have learned from growing up inside that world. I'll start off by saying that I've been following your journey for a very long time. I was given a copy of your book as a child. My dad is a Southern Baptist minister. He was actually teaching at the seminary in Louisville during this time period. So we had a little break from being PKs, but we were still like very immersed in the culture,
For
obviously.
sure.
They didn't push it on me. Like my parents didn't make me go the full courtship route. They did think it was great. They were like, if you want to, we would fully support this. But
Right.
I had the whole True Love Waits ceremony where my dad gave me the ring, like the whole creepy thing. We did all of that. So I've known of you for a very long time. I lost track of you for a period. And then about a year or so ago, I think I saw your appearance in Happy People on Amazon, the documentary that's focusing on a lot of the deconstruction going on around evangelical culture lately. And then I realized that you had actually made a public apology for I Kissed Dating Goodbye, your book. And I've been really interested in your journey, but I want to kind of start at the beginning, if that's okay, because I've seen a lot of talk about like where you are now, which I think is very interesting and we'll get into. But I have to assume, you write this book at age 21, right? 21? And it blows up. I mean, it sells over 1 million copies. I mean, you're bigger than Ariana Grande in terms of sales these days. Like people don't sell like this anymore. So you're thrust into the spotlight, I assume. But I'm really curious about how did you get there? What was your childhood like? How were you at age 2021 writing a book that had this, ability to impact the culture? Like what was your background like?
Well, I just need to say I definitely was not bigger than Ariana Grande. I don't want that to.
Just in terms of sales.
I mean, the funny thing is, I was thinking about this the other day. My kids throw around the term nepo baby. I was definitely a nepo baby in the evangelical world, in the sense that my dad was a very influential homeschool leader and teacher and speaker. So he, in the 80s and 90s, was traveling across the country every weekend doing his homeschooling workshops, speaking to hundreds of thousands of
Wow.
families over the course of that time. And so I was the kid in the illustrations. Like, I was the example of what homeschooling, could create or whatever. So I grew up around that. And then in my high school years, I really had literally a come to Jesus moment where I got serious about my relationship with God. And before that, I had been, just doing, as being as rebellious as a homeschooler can.
Right.
Essentially, I had like this secret girlfriend and we were messing around, and I wasn't taking seriously the things my parents were giving me to read, like Elizabeth Elliot's book Passion and Purity. I was just kind of like, oh brother, I don't want to deal with this. And then I had this moment where I was really convicted that this was this big part of my life that I wasn't honoring God in. I broke up with this girlfriend. I felt a lot of guilt around the things that we'd done, the promises that I had made, and so on. And so I had this moment as a 17-year-old where I wanted to give my life to serving the Lord. I was convicted. I was kind of imbibing all of this, teaching around true love waits, saving sex for marriage, and this idea that dating was actually this big distraction. And I decided to start writing and talking about this. And so I had a magazine for homeschool teens. This was like pre social media, pre, internet being everywhere. And that became this platform for me to interact with all these other students across the country. I was writing articles about these ideas. I gave a speech called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. I was traveling across the country doing conferences, and that really blew up and became the beginning of the book. And so, that opportunity to write at such a, relatively young age, and then have this response where the book was kind of seeded into churches and to communities and so on, was because I had this platform of a magazine and readers who are already excited about these ideas and conferences and so on. So that was the tipping point for those ideas to spill into a more popular level, where evangelicals were, buying the book and hearing about it, because this subculture of homeschoolers who had been talking about courtship for a while were the
Hmm.
ones that spread it.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because I, as a child, observed, and as I've aged, I've continued to observe the ways the two fields I've been very closely related to, both politics and religion, often
Yeah.
use kids as props to like advance their messages, right? They really love to have a
100%.
kid
Yes.
come in and preach. And I wonder, like, what are your feelings about that? Do you feel like that was pushed upon you by your parents? Because you were a little ahead of me in terms of like age. I think you were not quite 10 years older than me, but I
Okay.
really inherited like the thick of purity culture. By the time I was in middle school, it was up and
Yeah.
going. How much of
Right.
that was, already being pushed upon you, and how much of it do you feel like you and others that were your counterpoints at that time were like the drivers of it?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, so many things that you just said really resonate with me. Number one, I think it's so interesting how even like a 10-year gap in age can create a completely different context that you're growing up in. I mean, we talk about this. It feels like we talk about this even more today with the generations, because we're so hyper aware of all the generations, and like different generations like different memes and all those kinds of things. But the world that my book helped to create, I didn't even experience in the same way that you did, because I got married like a couple years after I wrote the book. I was a pastor, I was raising a family. I wasn't experiencing the dating scene and the ways that that evolved. In other words, like even the purity ceremony with a ring, like I never did anything like that. Like that wasn't my jam, but that's associated with, this world that sort of kind of snowballed into lots of different things. And then the other thing that I think is really fascinating is that the point that you make about kids being the spokespeople. And I just think that that is like, there's such a history in the church, probably dating back. I mean, you had the child crusades. I mean, there's the worst
Yeah.
example you could possibly come up with. But there's something that there's like the innocence and then the idealism. And when kids grab hold of ideas that, that their elders are pushing on them, they just have this passion and this, fervor that's not tempered by any life experience. You've not
Hmm.
been humbled by life not working out. I had this, this mindset of like, we're the generation that's going to do things the right way. And so there's some arrogance there. And then I think the evangelical community is, and this is commendable, they're always looking to the next generation. There's always this sense of, there's this promise, there's this change that's going to come, revival, and all those kinds of ideas. And so I didn't feel like it was being pushed on me. Like, I felt like I wanted this. Like, I
Hmm.
was very ambitious. I was, I idolized Billy Graham. I studied his life. I wanted to do big things for God. And it didn't feel like anybody was, pushing me from behind. It was like, this is what I want, but obviously the environment was one where that was held out as the ideal. And I grabbed hold of that. And then I was able to popularize ideas that were happening in, these subcultures that were much more conservative, like in the homeschool community. And because I was a young kid, it wasn't an adult, some 50-year-old dude saying it, it seemed much more plausible to students as well as parents.
Well, that's exactly it. You were a young guy, you were an attractive guy. I think it took away the element of like your parents telling you what to do and, this sort of
Mm,
like natural rebellious impulse that you would have in reaction to that kind of advice from an older person. And
right.
so I think that kids can be very useful pawns. And I don't always mean that people are sitting there like, let's figure out how to use the kids, but
Yeah.
I think there is a recognition of, these younger people can say things and there's less likelihood they're going to be attacked for it or dismantled in the same
Yeah.
way. They're going to be better received by their peers, and all of it's accurate and
Hmm.
true. But I think oftentimes, I look back at ways that I think I feel similar to you. I don't think my parents manipulated me or pushed me, but there were certainly times where I was using my platform or saying things I look back and I just cringe about now.
Yeah.
And, I was so indoctrinated in some ways and
Hmm.
was a good messenger. And, that's a perfect storm to like send somebody out
Yeah.
to do your bidding. And then you get a little older, you get some life experience, your brain is fully formed, and you start to look back on things you think or said or advocated for. And I think when it comes to purity culture, it's really interesting too, because there's obviously this huge conversation around the impacts of it based on gender, right? And how it may have
Mm,
impacted women differently than men. And I feel like even in the response that I've seen to you since you've come out and made your apology about the book, and actually you even asked that it be taken out of circulation. And
hmm.
there were a lot of people who gave you credit for that and who have thanked you for that and who've spoken out. But I've also seen people saying, well, now he needs to go away, right? He shouldn't speak
Mm,
anymore. This man needs to
right.
like take a back seat and he just needs to listen. And I really, I really dislike that. I feel like that's so unfair. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, as far as being a man who was used or who chose to speak about these issues. And like,
Mm.
do you think you received less grace for being a man when you did come out and apologize and take it back? Like, what do you think about that gender divide when it comes to the impacts of purity culture, but also the debate that
Yeah.
we're still having about it?
I feel so many conflicting emotions about it. The reality is that, I was a part of churches, and obviously my books reflect this. It's a very patriarchal message that I was communicating. And so, guys, the power imbalance there is very real. In other
Mhm.
words, even in purity culture, there's more blame placed on women. It's like, are you dressing modestly? Like, don't cause your brothers to stumble. All those kind of ideas. That wasn't a like kind of an equal. There wasn't an equal emphasis on responsibility between men and women. Um, and so I really sympathize with, the response of many women that are understandably angry at the ways that purity culture and my teaching impacted people and so on. Um, and I definitely hear and really, it hurts when people communicate that message of, hey, even though you've changed your mind, you don't have any place, in the conversation, or go away, that kind of a thing. And I think that's been a tough one for me. I mean, honestly, I've really wrestled with, like, oh yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe I've kind of, like, disqualified myself from ever speaking on anything, basically. And I've had to kind of come around to my own conviction that says, you know what? I participated in that kind of environment in the past, where we decide who gets to speak, who gets the microphone. We shut out, many voices. And I've realized, you know what? I don't want to participate in that again. I don't want to
Mhm.
be a part of, whatever you want to call it, kind of a new regime where it's like we decide who is allowed to communicate. I don't think that me showing up shuts anybody else down. In fact, there are moments where people will communicate those kinds of things, and I say, you know what an awesome moment. Like, you're speaking to me and you're communicating that. In the past, if we were, when in one of our old churches, you wouldn't have the confidence or the power or the freedom
Right.
to do that. Let's celebrate that moment. We can disagree about things. You might wish that I'd go away, but I want to welcome all the voices. I think it's so easy to think, oh, if we just shut these people down, everything will be great. But that mindset creates an environment that I think is really dangerous. I think we have to be able to let all the voices at the table, even the dudes, where there's been a huge imbalance over the years. So that's.
Yeah. I think it feels very unfair to me. I think there's a lack of grace. I think there is a lack of understanding about your age and how you likely grew up that led to that position. But I also just think it has a very harmful effect if we're telling people, hey, you can never be wrong, right? If you're
Mm,
wrong, you're done. You're out
yeah,
of potential
right.
leadership. Nobody's going to listen to you. You can't ever
Mm,
admit fault. That's creates the exact opposite of the culture we would want to have, whether it's in, the church or outside of it. But I think especially in the
yeah,
church, where's the grace? Where's the ability to have forgiveness? And where's the recognition that actually real leaders take account and they admit fault
yeah.
and then they redirect? Nobody's perfect. But I really think that's been a strong reaction I've felt when I've seen that sort of sentiment.
Mm,
It's far reaching. It's certainly not just in the context of this debate. Like I've seen it, often even in left wing circles when I was working in political, areas. And I would say, well, if we're canceling people, like why would they change? If that's
yeah.
the inroad, then most people have no reason to change their ways or come out of their environment where they're currently finding success and redirect. And so I think there has to be better avenues. And I think that when you really look at the purity culture debate, so much of it we just didn't know what we don't know. And I think that's always really important to keep in mind when we're having
Mm,
these conversations, even thanks to social media platforms and people sharing their experiences of what
mm-hmm.
the impacts are like. Ministers didn't have that 2-3 decades ago. We didn't
It's
have as
true.
much psychological research around it. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
always having that approach of grace and understanding, so long as people are trying to change and do better, is the right approach. But yeah, I saw a lot, and I'm curious if you saw this too. But when James Dobson died a few weeks ago, which is really what made me want to start speaking about religious
Mm,
issues a bit more widely, I found him to be far more harmful to my childhood than I ever found the purity culture side of
mm,
things. And I saw a lot of people sharing their experiences on TikTok talking about the psychological impacts of his parenting styles and what he advocated for. And it was a great opportunity, I think, for people to listen. But I found it seemed like it was an echo chamber, right? Where the people who had already deconstructed, the people who had already recognized the problems with religion, were not the ones that were engaging or really interacting. And when I spoke about it on my own social platforms, particularly from older generations, I just felt completely shut down. There was so much backlash. There was so much,
wow.
just speaking down to me about it. And I'm curious, like, what has your experience been as somebody who's blazing that trail, as far as both personal and professionally, coming out
Mm.
as you have? Has that hurt your relationship with your family? Has that been difficult for your inner circles? And I'm sure it's had an impact on you professionally too.
Yeah. I understand why doing what I've done, where I've actually, like, tried to go back and see the consequence of my ideas, talk to people who have been hurt by my books and writing, why that's so rare, relatively rare, because it sucks. Like, and I don't mean that to say, like, it realizing you're wrong is the worst part. It's the anger that you experience, and it's that experience of, basically, there's nothing you can do to make up for this. You're not doing enough, and the kind of exclusion that you experience from all sides. Like that
Hmm.
to me is the hardest part. And you're touching on that that point when you're saying like, hey, if we don't have room for saying, hey, people make mistakes, there's still a place for you in society, and there's still a, kind of a spot for you at the table, then people will never change. And I think that's the sad thing that we see it politically for sure. We see it, but we even, just see it like on a social media front, where it's
Hmm.
like people are unwilling, they're so afraid to engage even a slight sense of nuance, because as soon as they do, their group, whatever the in group is that they're part of, is like, don't give an inch on this topic. If you give an inch, you're going to slide into whatever the opposite group is, right?
Hmm.
And so there's no ability to say, hey, like, even though this person is in my camp, I think maybe they've gotten something wrong.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the fact that, yeah, they do some good things, but they've done some harmful things. It's like, if you're not like 100% towing the party line, whatever the party line is, left, right, whatever, you're going to get attacked by your own people who are going to want to pull you back and say, don't, if you compromise here, then we're going to lose. And so that's just a lonely place to be, because when you step away from your group, like for me, even when I started questioning the book, this was before I even started saying, "Hey, I don't think I'm believe in the same ways anymore." That was a whole nother that was a whole
Whole
nother
new
issue.
level.
But when I was just like starting to say, "I'm going to listen to people who were hurt by my book. I'm going to talk to LGBTQ plus people and say, what was that like being in a church that was shaped by the ideas in my book? I'm going to kind of invite their stories." Even then I had people being like, what are you doing? You're being soft, you're basically not being a good leader. You're being soft. Like that whole concept of, if you apologize or if you admit that you got anything wrong, it's going to open the floodgates of people questioning what else you got wrong.
Hmm.
And yes, that is a possible outcome of admitting you're wrong about something. But the problem with that is that if you can't consider that, you're locked in this cage of your own certainty and rightness, and you can never grow. You can
Hmm.
literally never grow, because you can't change. You can't admit that you could do something better. And so it's a really tough place. I mean, I definitely have had a lot of relationships negatively affected. I'm grateful that on a family front, my siblings, my dad have been very, I would say, gracious and loving. I mean, they express, my dad especially, he'll look for the opportunity to say, "I really hope you come back to these things," and so on. But for the most part, I would say he's just been a model of kindness and love in the midst of that. And so that's something I really appreciate. But I interact with so many people where their shifting, beliefs have cost them their families. It's really sad.
Yeah, it's interesting because, growing up as a preacher's kid, you're often told about other organized religions and, cults, and what makes a cult and what doesn't could be an entire YouTube video, I think. But, I often hear my mom point out, well, like, Mormons are in a cult because their families will cut them off if they leave. And I'm always like, so will a lot of Christians. So will many
Yeah.
people in your world too, so
Yeah.
it's always wonderful to hear that. I saw another woman on TikTok recently who was deconstructed and is married to a pastor, and I guess they're
Mm,
staying married. And I told her, I said, I'm so
that's
happy to hear
awesome.
that. It's I remember growing up and being told, if you step out of line, if you do something that is not very Christian, like your father could lose his job. It was always like kind of hung over our head, and like
Yes,
just the weight I
definitely.
think so many people feel in their relationships with their family that are in these religions, where it took me a really long time, I think, to even be able to figure out what I truly believed as an individual, because
Yeah.
it's more than just you're losing your religion. Like it's, in my case, the family business, it's your entire identity, it's
Hmm.
everything. And
Yeah.
so that can be really tough. And I'm assuming you've read some of Rachel Held Evans' work during your process, maybe not, but she was
Not a
really big
lot,
for
but
me.
yeah,
She was big.
really
And
influential. Yes.
yeah, it seems like, as best I can tell, where you ended up is sort of in a similar place where you don't call yourself a Christian anymore, but in reading your actual words, it seems like you do still have a level of faith or spirituality or belief that
Mm,
is just not being defined necessarily by organized religion anymore. Is that accurate, or would you?
yeah, I would say I'm definitely still in process. I do have I think I'm coming to this place of recognizing that the Christian faith is just like in my DNA. Like
Mhm.
there's no way that I can ever get away from how this story and view of the universe has shaped me, and it just runs so deep. So for me it's like a first language. It's like I might be able to learn other languages, but I always, that's my that's my first language. And so I'm kind of like, I think I'm at this strange place of trying to figure out if I'm still allowed to even call myself a Christian in a way. I
Mm.
know that that sounds strange, but I've just been realizing that, I grew up in a context where we were very quick to shun and kick people out if they didn't, line up with right beliefs, and if they didn't, do all the right things, and didn't sin in these certain ways and so on. And when my life fell apart, and when my beliefs began to shift, and when I got divorced and I did these things that I judged so many other people for, I kind of just like kicked myself out in a sense. There was like this, it was almost like this preemptive sense of, well, I've kicked all these other people out. I'm not allowed to be in. And I'm in this, process of, you know, learning, oh, there's a whole history of Christians throughout the ages who have read the Bible differently, who have
Mhm.
approached things in a way that was different than the very narrow and constrictive kind of approach that I had. And so I'm trying to kind of be more open. I'm recognizing that I don't have to kick myself out. Like there's a way to be a part of following Jesus, and that doesn't look like anything like what it used to. And that's why
Mhm.
it's hard for me to say I'm a Christian, because the old version of Christianity that I practiced was so different. But I'm learning that there's a much bigger tent than I thought there was.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you step outside of American Christianity, particularly like Southern driven American Christianity,
Mm,
which can be really hard to do because it is so dominant and because it has been so politically pervasive in recent years. Like there's been this huge
definitely.
convergence, of the GOP with Christianity to the point where, and I talk to my father about this all the time, who is a wonderful pastor and truly grounded, I think,
Mm,
in scripture and in Jesus's teachings. But I often tell him, I'm like, the Christians in America have no idea what's Christianity and what's GOP doctrine. Like they can't tell the
mm,
difference anymore, truly, genuinely. And you can see it
mm,
on multiple fronts. And they'll be the first to try to kick you out as a Christian if you're not politically aligned with them, even if what
yeah.
you're saying is more based in Jesus's teachings than theirs. So it's complicated, I think, and it can be very isolating. But I think it's so
Mm,
important that more and more people are starting to have these conversations, and particularly having them in the way that you're having them, because I think I'm in the same boat where I still consider myself a Christian, and I've had difficulty figuring out, is that the right term or is that how I should
yeah.
describe myself? But I mean, at the base, I believe in Jesus. I believe in following the teachings of Jesus. I believe in living as Jesus tells us to
Mm,
live. So I think that makes me a Christian, and I think I have as much right to use it as many of the other people who are
yeah.
using it for very,
Right.
very twisted ways. So I want to circle back to where that deconstruction started for you. I assume it first started, as you mentioned, with the book versus your
Mm,
faith at large. Like, what were the first cracks, and what do you think about purity culture now? Are there still elements where you're like, yeah, I see why I thought this, or I still think this part of it's
mm,
good. It was just these things that kind of started to unravel.
yeah. Yeah, my process of starting to, you know, I can use the term deconstruction. Another way to describe that is there being cracks in my like absolute certainty that I had a lock on the best version of faith and so on. Like I just thought I was in the not just a good Christian church, but like the best version of Christian, a Christian church. We had the best doctrine, we had the right practice, we had the right mix of reformed theology and charismatic practice, and we believed all the right things about men and women, blah blah blah. We had this real sense of if you believe rightly, then you're safe. And the first cracks in that, edifice was basically realizing that there were people in that church community who had had a very different experience than I had had and had been hurt. They weren't at the top of the of the pyramid of power, you know. And a lot of that was tied to the power of the internet. Like you mentioned this earlier, I don't think we've really grappled with what a massive revolution that has caused in the world, but essentially all these people who had no voice and no ability to share their stories or corroborate on their experiences. They were always just being talked to by some pastor on a stage, by some man on a stage. Suddenly they had the ability to start going online and saying, hey, this happened to me and this was hard. And so anonymous blogs were popping up about our church movement.
Wow.
And that was terrifying. And the leaders were like, this is gossip, this is slander, and all these kinds of things. But people were sharing their stories, and it led to stories about the abuse of power, people just being kicked aside if they didn't homeschool, if they weren't like, if their kids weren't behaving, if whatever it might be. But then also much more serious things like our a child was abused and we went to the pastors and they told us to handle it this way, and all these kinds of things began to surface. And this is back when I was still a pastor of a mega church in the Washington D.C. area. And we were a team of guys that we were trying to do what we thought was the right thing. And we're reading in First Peter where it talks about this is what shepherds are supposed to do. They're not supposed to lord it over their flock. And so we started having these meetings where people came into my home and we let them share their stories.
Wow.
And it was controversial. Other leaders in the movement wanted to shut that down. They hated that we were doing this. But that was really the beginning for me of realizing I thought that I was a part of something that was all built on grace and the gospel. I thought that we were creating this environment that was all about God's love, but the reality is we've created a culture where people are afraid, where they
Mhm.
get shunned if they don't live up to a certain standard. And I started to hear how my writing had participated in that, had contributed to that. And so that was like, we apologized to the church for things. We had a meeting where we came and we apologized, and we were just on the beginning of trying to process that internally when our whole church movement just exploded with like a scandal of leaders disagreeing and then being hit with a lawsuit about sex abuse, all these things that were I look back now and it's like, if I believe in God, he was cleaning things out. Like he was coming in and being like, you guys need you need to change. um but that was the beginning, and it led to me eventually, after we went through those storms, stepping down from being a pastor, which was an acknowledgement of I don't have all the answers.
Mhm.
Like I came to a place of saying I can't lead this church out of these problems because I was trained in these ways of thinking. Like this is all that I know. And so going to seminary was this huge acknowledgement that I needed to learn and become a student again. And that was the beginning of a process of learning, humbling myself in the fact that there's a history of Christianity that I haven't engaged in. There's streams of Christianity I haven't engaged in. That was the beginning of me rethinking my book, doing that publicly. And so there was sort of like the almost like the dominoes falling of these different identities. Like, I'm the pastor who has the answers. No, I'm not. I'm a best-selling author who's changed all these lives. No, actually, you've hurt tons of people. I've got a great marriage and my book worked. No, actually, your own marriage has these problems and is ending. And so it's like all those dominoes were falling, and it was less this like deconstruction process of I don't agree with a particular doctrine. It was really like my identity falling apart underneath me and going, what's actually still there? Like, what do I actually believe? So
Mhm.
it was an undoing for me.
I think it's so interesting and poignant that you correctly point over and over, both in your public apology and also in conversation, to like the fear element that drives so much of
Mm,
this. I actually took a screenshot of part of your apology that I really liked that said, I saw my book had many flaws and my effort to set a high standard. The book emphasized practices like avoiding dating and kissing before marriage and concepts like giving your heart away, things that are not found in the Bible. I see now that in trying to warn people about the pitfalls of dating, the book instilled fear in many readers: fear of making
mm,
mistakes, fear of having their hearts broken, fear of failing to live up to an ideal, fear of their own sexuality. And you went on to
mm,
say the book also gave the impression that following a specific methodology for relationships would guarantee a happily ever after, a perfect marriage, a great sex life, and a life free of relational pain. But life doesn't work that way, and these outcomes are not promised in scripture. And I really appreciated you saying that, because I do think a lot of purity culture and really just kind of the fundamentalism that had evangelicalism in its grip, and I think largely continues to, does seem very fear motivated to me, right? Very
Mm-hmm.
much like, if I do these things right, then I have it figured out. I'm going to have this perfect life. And it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. I don't know how much you followed like the online sort of growth in the trad movement, and some of this regrowth in the conversations around like traditional gender roles, and how you
Mm-hmm.
should be structuring your relationship. And it carries many of these same elements forward, where, we've got this culture of people who are now very avoidant. Most young people are not even entering relationships. We have a huge problem
Mm-hmm.
around that. They're all terrified of getting hurt. And it's like they're being sold this idea that if you just follow these very fundamentalist sort of ways of practicing religion, then you'll be able to avoid all of these
Mm-hmm.
pitfalls. And
Yeah.
you point out, in your own marriage that didn't work out for you. I'm curious, like, do you see those ties right now? Do you think it's a continuation, or do you think that we're seeing this like cyclical sort of nature of culture, where all of a sudden people are turning back to some of these ideas that were a bit more prominent in the 90s and 2000s?
Yeah. I do think there are cycles to these things. I also think that people should be free to, live the life they want to, as long as they're a consenting adult, as long as they're not harming other people and so on. So it's like, I want to be careful not to say, hey, like any someone who wants to save sex for marriage and be in a marriage with traditional gender roles and so on, if they're choosing that and they want that, and that's the like, they should have the freedom to be able to do that without me, piling on or criticizing and so on. I think you pinpoint the issue, a problematic issue in my opinion, being fear. If
Mm-hmm.
you're using fear to manipulate other people, if you're using that to control them, if you're using theology, a theology of, divine punishment and exclusion, then people are not actually making a choice of freedom and their own joy. And this is what I want. They're like, I have to do this. I have to do this, or else I'll be excluded, and so on. So that's the thing that really I think is dangerous. And I think that comes, I think we need to acknowledge that comes from the left just as much as it does from the right. It's just a different set of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So there can still be this, if you don't do it these ways, you will be canceled. We will, we'll make your life hell
Absolutely.
now. You won't have any place, we'll destroy you, that kind of mindset. And there's definitely a dogma on that side as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I've come around to this place of like, understanding like there are reasons why religion will always have a powerful place in any society, in any moment in history, because religion kind of gives people the container to do the things that they want to do, often also gives them the structure to control other people, to mobilize people, to get certain things done. And so I do think you're going to see, I mean, I think you are saying a return to some of those same kind of ideals and patterns. Now it's on TikTok, whatever that might look like. I think someone will probably write a book very similar to Ike is Dating Goodbye, but it'll be repackaged in kind of the lingo of the day and so on. um, and I think I have a place of like more of a sense of like, what, that's understandable. These are look at the human motivations. Like when people are surrounded with chaos and uncertainty, they're gonna draw to anything that says, hey, you're gonna be safe here. Here's a
Mm-hmm.
place for you. Here's where you can find meaning and purpose and so on. And so I think we all just have to ask ourselves, like, are we contributing to a healthier society? Are we trying to make things safe and so that all people can thrive? And if you see others that are going down a dogmatic, controlling, cult-like kind of path, at the root of a lot of that, I do think is fear and trying to find stability. That was the case with my parents and the Jesus movement coming out of the
Mm-hmm.
60s. And I think we're seeing it again.
Yeah, I've noticed this a lot. I mean, not always, but a lot of the people that I hear the loudest when it comes to these conversations online right now, they're not people like me, right, who came from stable families and who came from this whole world and have kind of seen like the extremities
Mm.
it can go to and some of
Yeah.
the pitfalls of it. They're people who usually came from the opposite. It's a lot of people who came
Yeah.
from divorce, who came from families that were not based in religion. And I do think there's this attraction to them of like, and I've often heard this said to me actually over the years by ex-boyfriends and by friends of like, well, you had the fairy tale, you know, you can't understand your parents
Mm.
stayed together. And they just had this idea that like, if your parents stay together and they have a long marriage and your dad's religious, you're in the church, then like your family's perfect or your life is perfect and you're not going to have
Interesting.
all of this, you know,
Hmm.
all these problems, all this heartache that I went through. And it's very interesting having grown up in that perspective where I'm like, pastors' families can be a hot mess. And I love my family, but like I wouldn't wish being a pastor's kid on my worst enemy. It's not a fun role. But there is this, you know, perception that I think is interesting. And I do think you're absolutely right about the parallels on the left and right. You know, the right is currently really pushing like the traditional gender roles and get married young and women should not go to college and just be stay-at-home moms. But then you have on the
Mm.
left, you know, women saying never get married, stay single forever, you know, men will ruin your life if you're married and kids will ruin your life,
Yeah.
and like really pushing this very extreme opposite. And I think both are sad because I think human relationships are important. I think that having a partner is a beautiful, wonderful thing that we would hope to see more people being able to
Mm.
find and build with. But it does seem that the dogma on both sides is increasingly leading itself away from that and actually creating more division between men and women oftentimes, because men are looking for something that women don't want and women are looking for something that men don't want, and so they're not able to find partnership. And I think that that's a really interesting phenomenon happening right now in our society, and one in which, you know, you would hope to see the church stepping into and fostering more unity between the genders and more opportunities
Mm.
for people who are of good character to come together and meet. And I'm just curious, like, you know, from your experience, and you've really had the full span of the gap from being a leader in the
Mm.
church and running the church to now, you know, working to push back on some of these ideas the churches have held. Like, what do you think it would take to get the church to actually buy into a new pathway forward, to actually hold out an olive branch for people who maybe have faith without trying to
Mm.
manipulate and control and coerce, and to focus so heavily
Yeah.
on, you know, people's bodies and those kinds of choices, but instead to create more of a big tent and foster that kind of community, because I
Mm.
don't know who else does it in our society if it's not the church. But I don't see the church stepping in as I would like to see right now.
Mm. It's such a great question. I'm partnering with this really incredible woman named Dr. Hilary McBride, who is a psychologist and has written a book called Holy Hurt that's about spiritual trauma and how, what it looks like to heal and to acknowledge the reality of pain that's caused in spiritual context, families and churches and so on. And so we've been going around to different cities and putting on these events. They're just like not for profit events where I'm trying to just participate by telling my story, which is very different. Like Hillary's coming from a research, standpoint and so on, and I'm telling my own story. And one of the things that's been so powerful for me about this experience is just getting to interact with people in these different cities. Many of them are Christian, some are like former Christians or they're different places, but a lot of them are participating in churches that want to do things differently. They're specifically saying we want to be a place for people who've been hurt by the church. We don't want to be a place that is, exclusionary. They're affirming, they're, all these different things. And it's been eye-opening for me, honestly, like to realize like, oh, there are people out there that are really trying to do something different. They might not be the mega churches and get the headlines, but there's something really beautiful, I think, that's taking place. And as I think about even like the story of scripture and the history of the church, like that's always kind of been the story. Like, even in the Bible itself, it's like, here are the people of God. How are they doing? They're totally messing up. Like there's only one guy that's still faithful. There's like this little pocket, and the church itself, it's like the book of Acts, look how amazing this is. And then history, what happens? Oh, it gets taken over by the Roman government because they realized, oh, this could be really useful. Like this is like this story is so kind of embedded and is right there. And even Jesus himself, he's like speaking to the powers that be and how they're using people and manipulating them and not really, having a heart for a real relationship with God. It's like, oh, like that's right there in the very story itself. And so I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, I think again, I think churches should have the freedom to be able to teach the things. I would like to live in a country that has that kind of religious freedom, that even if they teach things that I think are a little backwards or whatever, that they're allowed to do that and people can opt into that in a way that there's real choice. But I hope that the sharing of stories will be the thing that will lead to a softening in all directions, in a sense.
Mhm.
It's like, if we're not able to sit with people and say, "Oh, like I taught this, or I wrote this and I said this and I meant this, but then the actual impact in your life were these negative things." If we can't hear those stories, then we can never adjust and change. And so I hope that those scriptures that speak to having, a real shepherd's heart and loving others as you love yourself, and all of those messages will be taken to heart by people on all ends of the spectrum, and we'll start listening to each other's stories and realizing, oh, we need a lot more nuance, we need a lot more grace for all of us. We're all messing up in different ways, none of us are meeting the standards. Like, what would it look like for us to really love those that are weak and downtrodden, because that's all of us.
Mhm. You make such an amazing point that I've never thought about, but it is like the story of the church and its history is the official organizations being co-opted by people who maybe don't have the true heart
Mm,
seeking Jesus, by the Pharisees, if you will, and then the
yeah.
true church having to kind of start again underground and continuing to
Mm,
spread and like regroup and reorganize and continuing to find a way to like come up again, to spring up through
yeah.
the dirt again. And I think that's a very encouraging thought. And that's wonderful to hear about that movement happening right now in the States. I must admit, I've very much like recoiled from the church since 2016, where I'm just like, I don't
Yeah.
associate with these people. I don't really feel connectivity with most of them anymore. And it's,
Mm,
it can be isolating. And I think there's a lot of people who like are in my camp who would really like to find others to have
mm,
community with and to share with and to support one another. But it can be hard
yeah.
to find the right place to fit. So it's very encouraging to hear, and maybe that'll help me and others start looking for things in our own areas. I don't have any other questions for you. This was wonderful. Half the questions I had for you, you answered. So you were tracking in the same
That's
mindset.
awesome.
But I just really admire what you've done and the ability you've had to come out and take accountability, but continue weighing in on what's happening. I think it's really important that your voice is in the mix. So I appreciate the stand you've taken. I know it's taken a lot of courage, and I'm sure some personal losses behind the scenes. It's not without any consequence, I'm sure, but I just really do appreciate it. And I think it is consequential. So thank you so much. Where can I direct people to find you if they want to learn more? Or are you going to write any more books?
Yeah.
What's the plan?
Oh, yeah. First of all, I really enjoyed this conversation. Like, just your perspective and insights are really refreshing, and so I'm just grateful that you're out there making your voice heard. I am starting to write. I'm working on a book where I'm just processing my own story, and it's kind of something I need to do for myself. And if it turns into something that I can share with others, that would be really exciting. But yeah, I've just got a website, joshharris.com, that kind of points to all the stuff that I'm doing, and that's the best way to see that.
Okay, great. Well, we'll put that in the show notes. People, make sure you follow Josh. You can also follow him on Twitter. I'll include that too. He's really a great voice to listen to. So, Josh, thanks so much again. And I hope we'll continue to stay in conversation because I want to keep up with what you're doing.